I still remember the first day I saw him. The city was alive with the usual chaos, people rushing to work, street vendors calling out their wares, and the constant symphony of car horns that somehow blended into the background of urban life. I was running late for my morning coffee meeting, dodging through the crowd with practiced precision, when I quite literally bumped into him outside the subway entrance. Coffee splashed across both our shirts, and I immediately launched into an apology, but the words died in my throat when our eyes met. His name was Elijah, and he had the kind of smile that made you forget what you were saying mid-sentence. He was tall, with dark curly hair that fell just above his eyes, and he wore a simple white button-up that now had a brown stain spreading across the front. But instead of being annoyed, he laughed, a genuine, warm sound that seemed to rise above the city noise around us. "Don't worry about it," he said, dabbing at his shirt with a napkin. I was looking for an excuse to be fashionably late anyway. His voice had a slight rasp to it, like someone who stayed up late talking about life's big questions. I introduced myself as Marcus, a 26-year-old graphic designer who had moved to the city 3 years ago chasing dreams of creative freedom and independence. What I didn't tell him was how lonely those 3 years had been, how the city's promise of connection often felt like an illusion when you spent most nights alone in a tiny apartment. We exchanged numbers under the pretense of me paying for his dry cleaning, though we both knew it was just an excuse. There was something magnetic about him, something that made me want to know more. As I finally made it to my coffee meeting, 20 minutes late, and with a half-empty cup, I couldn't stop thinking about the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. 3 days later, we met at a small cafe tucked between a bookstore and a vintage record shop. The place was known for its mismatched furniture and excellent espresso, and it felt intimate enough for a first, whatever this was. I wouldn't call it a date, at least not out loud, but my nervous energy suggested otherwise. Elijah was already there when I arrived, reading a dog-eared copy of a Gabriel Garcia Marquez novel. He looked up as I approached, marking his place with a train ticket before closing the book. "I was beginning to think you had a habit of being late," he teased, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Only when it involves spilling things on strangers," I replied, settling into the wooden chair. Our conversation flowed easily, jumping from books to music to the strange characters we'd encountered in the city. He worked as a music teacher at a local high school, and the way he talked about his students, with such genuine care and enthusiasm, made something warm unfurl in my chest. As afternoon turned to evening, we decided to walk through the nearby park. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the path and turning the sky into a watercolor of oranges and pinks. We were discussing our favorite films when he suddenly stopped walking. "You know what?" he said, turning to face me. "I've been wanting to do this since you spilled coffee on me." And before I could ask what he meant, he reached for my hand, his fingers wrapping gently around my wrist. There was a moment of suspended time where neither of us moved, where the only sound was the distant laughter of children and the rustle of leaves above us. Then, with a playful smile, he turned and placed my wrist in his back pocket. "Keep it there," he said softly, his eyes never leaving mine. "I like knowing you're close." The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate without being overtly sexual, that I felt heat rise to my cheeks. My hand was now resting against the warmth of his body, our sides pressed together as we continued walking. It was a simple act, yet it felt profoundly significant, a physical manifestation of connection, of choosing to be in someone's space. "Is this your smooth move?" I asked, trying to mask my nervousness with humor. "Do you put all your first dates' hands in your pockets?" He laughed, the sound vibrating through his body and into mine. "Definitely not. This is a Marcus-exclusive experience." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "Unless you're uncomfortable, I can be a bit impulsive sometimes." "No," I said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "No, it's nice." And it was. There was something wonderfully possessive about the gesture, something that made me feel both protected and desired. We continued our walk, now moving as one unit, our steps falling into rhythm together. That evening marked the beginning of something I hadn't expected to find. Over the following weeks, Elijah and I fell into a pattern of coffee shops, movie nights, and long walks through different neighborhoods. Each time we were together, there was that same physical closeness, a hand on my knee during dinner, fingers intertwined while watching a film, my wrist tucked into his pocket as we explored the city. I learned that Elijah had grown up in a small conservative town, the kind where being different was treated as a contagious disease. He'd left at 18, determined to build a life where he could be himself without apology. Music saved me, he told me one night as we lay on my apartment floor, sharing a bottle of wine and listening to vinyl records. When everything else felt wrong, music made sense. I shared my own story too, how I'd always known I was gay but had struggled with what that meant for my future, how my parents had needed time to adjust but eventually became my strongest supporters. Not everyone gets that, I said, thinking of the stories Elijah had told me about his family's reaction. No, he agreed, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm. But everyone deserves it. As our relationship deepened, so did the challenges we faced. Elijah was open about his life with his colleagues and students, proudly displaying a small rainbow flag on his desk. But I was more reserved, especially at work where my creative director made occasional homophobic jokes that everyone laughed off as just his generation. I hadn't brought Elijah to company events, hadn't mentioned him in casual conversations about weekend plans. The issue came to a head when my agency was hosting a gallery opening for our biggest client. Everyone was encouraged to bring a +1, and Elijah naturally assumed he would attend with me. The night before the event, as we were cooking dinner in his small but cozy kitchen, I awkwardly explained that I thought it might be better if I went alone. Because I'm a man? He asked directly, setting down the knife he'd been using to chop vegetables. There was no anger in his voice, just a quiet hurt that was somehow worse. Because my boss is... I struggled to find the right words. He's not the most accepting person, and this client is really important to the agency. Elijah was silent for a long moment, his eyes focused on the cutting board. You know, he finally said, when I was 20, I dated a guy who would only see me in private. We'd go to restaurants in different towns. We'd wait until his roommates were gone to spend time together. For 6 months, I was his secret. He looked up at me then, his gaze steady. I promised myself I'd never be someone's secret again. His words hit me like a physical blow. That's not what this is, I protested, but even as I said it, I knew there was truth in his assessment. I wasn't hiding him because I was ashamed of him. I was hiding him because I was afraid of the consequences of being fully myself in all aspects of my life. Isn't it? He asked quietly. Marcus, I care about you. A lot. But I need to be with someone who's proud to be with me, who doesn't compartmentalize their life into places where I'm allowed and places where I'm not. That night, he asked me to leave. Not forever, he clarified, but because we both needed space to think. As I walked home through the darkened streets, I felt the absence of his hand holding mine, the empty space where my wrist should have been tucked safely in his pocket. The next day at the gallery opening, I moved through the crowd with a plastic smile, accepting congratulations and making small talk, while feeling utterly disconnected from everyone around me. My creative director was in rare form, loud and obnoxious after too many complimentary glasses of champagne. When he made yet another derogatory joke, looking to me for approval as he always did, something inside me finally snapped. Actually, I said, my voice carrying more than I intended, I don't find that funny. My boyfriend wouldn't either. The silence that followed felt eternal, though it probably lasted only seconds. My boss looked surprised, then uncomfortable. Didn't know you had a boyfriend, he muttered, before quickly excusing himself to talk to someone else. And just like that, the world didn't end. The client didn't fire us. My colleagues didn't treat me differently. In fact, several expressed support later in the evening. The only thing that had changed was the lightness I felt, the relief of no longer carrying the weight of selective disclosure. I left the event early and went straight to Elijah's apartment. When he opened the door, his eyes widened in surprise. I was still wearing my suit from the gallery, slightly rumpled from the subway ride. I told them about you, I said without preamble. I told my boss, my colleagues, everyone. And I realized something important. I took a deep breath. I'm not afraid of what they think. I'm afraid of losing you because I was too cowardly to be honest about who I am and who I love. Elijah's expression softened, but he didn't immediately invite me in. What changed? He asked. I did, I replied simply. Or maybe I just remembered who I actually am. Someone who promised himself he wouldn't hide anymore when he moved to this city. He studied my face for a long moment before stepping aside to let me in. We talked for hours that night, about fear and courage, about the different ways we both learned to protect ourselves, and about what we wanted from each other and from our relationship. "I don't need grand gestures," Elijah said as dawn began to break outside his window. "I just need to know that I'm not something you're ashamed of. You're something I'm grateful for," I told him, reaching for his hand. "And I want everyone to know it." The following months brought changes big and small. I started looking for a new job at an agency with a more inclusive culture. Elijah met my parents when they visited for Thanksgiving, charming them completely with his knowledge of obscure jazz musicians that my dad loved. We created routines together: Sunday morning farmers markets, Wednesday night cooking experiments, lazy Saturday afternoons reading side by side. And always, there were those moments of physical connection that had started with that first gesture in the park. Sometimes I would be the one to take his wrist, placing it against my heart or in my own pocket, watching his face light up with recognition and affection. 6 months after our reconciliation, we were walking through the same park where he'd first pulled me close. The seasons had changed, summer giving way to fall, and the trees were ablaze with red and gold. We stopped at a bench overlooking the small lake, watching ducks glide across the surface as the setting sun painted everything in warm light. "I have something for you," Elijah said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small box, and my heart immediately began racing. It wasn't a ring box. It was slightly larger, more like something that would hold a watch or bracelet. "What's this?" I asked, taking it from him with slightly trembling hands. "Open it and see." Inside was a simple leather bracelet with a small silver clasp. On the inside, barely visible unless you knew to look, were our initials and the date we'd met. "I thought," he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, "that sometimes when I'm not there to put your wrist in my pocket, you might want something to remind you that you're still kept." The word choice wasn't lost on me. Kept, as in cherished, as in held on to, as in chosen. I wordlessly extended my wrist, and he fastened the bracelet around it, his fingers lingering on my pulse point. "I love you," I said, the words feeling both monumental and utterly natural. "And I want to keep you too." His smile was brilliant, full of joy and promise. "You already do," he assured me, leaning in for a kiss that felt like coming home. Looking back now, I realized that moment in the park, that first "keep it there," was about so much more than physical closeness. It was an invitation to intimacy, to vulnerability, to the kind of connection that requires courage from both people involved. It was Elijah saying, "I choose you, I want you close, I'm not afraid of what that means." And eventually, it was me learning to say the same thing back, not just with words but with actions. To choose openness over fear, authenticity over safety, love over the comfortable numbness of hiding. The city is still chaotic, still full of rushing people and blaring horns. But now, as I navigated streets with Elijah beside me, his fingers often linked with mine or my wrist tucked safely in his pocket, I understand something I didn't before. True connection doesn't happen despite vulnerability. It happens because of it. That simple gesture, "keep it there," wasn't just the beginning of our story. It was an invitation to write a new one together, page by page, day by day, with all the messy, beautiful honesty that love demands. And every day, in ways both small and significant, we choose to accept that invitation again. Total _char_count, 17,312.